The establishment of the Richery system in Japan, with its comprehensive legal and administrative codes, was a direct and ambitious attempt to centralize power and model the imperial state on the sophisticated governance structures of Tang Dynasty China. Implemented during the late 7th and early 8th centuries, this system created a framework for a powerful central government, a national land allocation scheme, and a conscripted military. However, the system's reliance on a large and often absent bureaucracy created the conditions for its own slow and irreversible decline. The imperial court in the new capital of Heijiki became increasingly preoccupied with courtly rituals, artistic pursuits, and the delicate balance of aristocratic power, gradually losing effective administrative control over the vast and distant provinces. This growing detachment from the periphery of the empire created a political vacuum that provincial governors and powerful clans were quick to fill. They began to accumulate private estates known as shen by circumventing the public land ownership system. Laws like the Konden einen Shizai Ha, which allowed for the permanent ownership of newly cultivated land, were originally intended to stimulate agricultural growth, but were exploited by ambitious local elites. These elites, often powerful aristocrats or Buddhist temples, offered tax exemptions and other protections, causing more land to be converted into shan and effectively removing it from the central government's tax base. With the imperial court's conscripted army, the Gundan becoming increasingly ineffective and disorganized, the owners of these burgeoning shen were forced to seek their own means of protection. They hired armed retainers, loyal to the local lord rather than to the emperor, to protect their land and wealth from rival clans, peasant uprisings, and local bandits. These armed men, initially little more than private guards, were the nascent form of the warrior class. They were skilled in martial arts, equestrian combat, and archery, and their loyalty was secured through land grants, a direct bond of fealty that bypassed the imperial court entirely. But the history of Japan's samurai warriors raises many questions. How did a government system designed to centralize power under the emperor inadvertently create the very conditions for the samurai to rise as provincial warlords? What was the hidden history of the Onobugeisha, and how did these female martial artists fight for the honor and survival in the world dominated by male warriors? Why was the legendary samurai code of Bushido not formally codified, and how was it later reinterpreted to become the foundation of a modern Japan's national military? The word samurai itself derives from the verb saburao, meaning to serve or to attend on, indicating the early warrior's primary role as a retainer. As the power of these provincial strongmen and their private armies grew, the central government's authority waned, and Japan's political landscape became increasingly decentralized. The warriors began to group into larger, more cohesive clans, each with its own leadership and political agenda. This new military aristocracy, the Buke, was not yet in a position to rule, but its influence was growing with every passing decade, and the stage was set for a future in which their military might would eclipse the power of the imperial court for centuries. The political landscape of the Heian period was dominated by the Fujiwara clan, who, through a series of strategic marriages and diplomatic maneuvering, effectively controlled the imperial court and its civil administration. Yet, their power did not extend to the vast, turbulent countryside, where a different kind of authority was taking shape. From this environment, the Seiwa Genji clan emerged as a pivotal force. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The Genji, a name given to imperial princes who were removed from the line of succession and granted the surname Minamoto, had an unusual combination of imperial lineage and a powerful military reputation. Their descent from Emperor Seiwa provided a crucial degree of aristocratic legitimacy, which distinguished them from other provincial strongmen and allowed them to operate with a degree of authority that others could not claim. The imperial court, while controlling the administrative levers of power in the capital, was largely incapable of responding to the rebellions and conflicts that erupted in the distant provinces. It was to the Seiwa Genji, with their martial prowess and network of loyal retainers, that the court turned for military support. The Genji were repeatedly tasked with suppressing major uprisings, such as the Zenkunen War and the Gosanen War in the northern provinces. Their successful campaigns, often fought far from the comforts of the capital, not only demonstrated their military effectiveness, but also solidified their position as the emperor's most capable and trusted military arm. This strategic role gave the Seiwa Genji a unique position in Japanese society. They were a bukiya military family but one, with a direct and legitimate connection to the imperial bloodline. This dual identity allowed them to build a powerful network of loyal followers across the provinces, creating a military infrastructure that was completely independent of the imperial court's bureaucracy. While the Fujiwara clan's power was confined to the court in Kyoto, the Genji's influence extended across the entire nation, built on a foundation of military service and personal loyalty. The Genji's rise established a crucial precedent for a military aristocracy that could govern with both martial strength and an air of noble legitimacy. Their successful campaigns and the loyalties they forged in the provinces created a powerful counterweight to the court's authority. This shift in power dynamics, which saw a warrior clan become the de facto enforcers of imperial will, was a critical and irreversible step in the institutionalization of the warrior class. The stage was now set for a struggle between the two great warrior houses, the Taira and the Minamoto, for complete control of the nation's political and military destiny. The Rituary system's decline left the Heian court in a state of political instability, a vacuum of power that the warrior clans were only too eager to fill. The Heian Rebellion of 1156 was the first major military conflict to erupt directly from a succession dispute within the imperial court, forcing the two most powerful warrior clans, the Taira Heike and the Minamoto Genjito, choose sides. Emperor Go Shirakawa and the retired Emperor Sutoku each commanded the support of different aristocratic factions, and this division created a unique opportunity for the warrior class to wield unprecedented influence over imperial politics. Both the Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoshitomo, and the Taira clan, led by Taira no Kiyomori, committed their military forces to the conflict. Their victory, on behalf of Emperor Go Shirakawa, demonstrated that the imperial court was now entirely dependent on the military might of the warrior clans for its continued existence. This rebellion, though brief, marked a profound shift in the balance of power, as the Taira and Minamoto clans proved themselves to be the ultimate arbiters of imperial authority. The Heian Rebellion's aftermath was critical to the next stage of conflict. The Taira clan, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, emerged as the dominant force in the capital, displacing the Minamoto from their position of influence. Kiyomori, a skilled politician as well as a military commander, solidified his power by placing his relatives in key government positions, creating a military government that was deeply embedded within the imperial court's bureaucracy. This period of Taira dominance, however, bred resentment and suspicion among other clans, particularly the Minamoto, who were systematically excluded from power and prestige. This simmering rivalry finally exploded into open war with the Genpei War of 1180. The conflict was sparked by a call to arms from Prince Mochihito, a member of the imperial family who opposed Taira rule and sought to restore power to the emperor. This rebellion provided the Minamoto clan now led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, with a legitimate pretext to challenge the Taira's authority. The ensuing 5-year conflict was a struggle for complete military and political control of the nation, a true clash between two visions for Japan's future. The Taira, who had grown accustomed to the courtly life of Kyoto, were perceived as an extension of the elegant but fragile aristocracy, while the Minamoto, based in the rugged Kant region, represented a more provincial, martial way of life. The war culminated in a series of decisive naval battles, with the Minamoto forces gradually gaining the upper hand. The final epochal engagement was the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, where the Taira navy was completely destroyed. The annihilation of the Taira clan at this battle marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. With their primary rival eliminated, the Minamoto clan was left as the undisputed military master of Japan, ready to establish a new form of government entirely independent of the imperial court's influence. Following his decisive victory at the Battle of Dan no Ura and the complete destruction of the Taira clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged as the sole military authority in Japan. With his formidable army and a vast network of loyal retainers, he held the power to seize the imperial throne. However, Yoritomo, a master of both military strategy and political foresight, understood that the long-term legitimacy of his rule would be better secured by upholding rather than overthrowing the imperial institution. He recognized that a direct challenge to the emperor's divine authority would likely alienate powerful religious institutions and aristocratic factions. Instead, he chose to establish a new form of government, a military bureaucracy that would coexist with the imperial court while exercising ultimate control. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo received the title of Sei Taish Gun, or Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Force Against the Barbarians, from the Emperor. This title, originally a temporary military position, was reinterpreted by Yoritomo as a permanent commission to govern the nation's military and administrative affairs. He established his government, known as the Bakufu, literally tent government, in the distant city of Kamakura, far from the influence of the decadent imperial court in Kyoto. This strategic separation of powers created a dual government structure that would define Japan's political landscape for centuries: a ceremonial imperial court in Kyoto and a de facto military government in Kamakura. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate was a revolutionary act that officially shifted the center of power from the aristocratic class to the warrior aristocracy. Yoritomo and the samurai who supported him were not content with merely controlling the military. They sought to create a system that guaranteed their dominance over all aspects of Japanese society. To accomplish this, Yoritomo appointed his loyal retainers to two key positions: the Shugo constables and the JIT, stewards. The Shugo were assigned to each province to supervise local samurai and maintain order, while the JIT were appointed to individual estates to collect taxes and manage the land. This new system effectively cemented the samurai's role as the de facto rulers of Japan. The Shugo and JIT represented the shogunate's authority at the local level, ensuring that power was held by samurai loyal to Yoritomo and his government. The samurai, now with legal authority over taxation and governance, transitioned from being mere armed retainers to being the administrative and political masters of the provinces. This consolidation of power, achieved without a single direct assault on the imperial throne, was the cornerstone of the Kamakura shogunate and marked the official beginning of a long era of samurai rule. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate by Minamoto no Yoritomo had solidified samurai control over Japan, but the imperial court in Kyoto remained a potential center of resistance. Following Yoritomo's death, the political stability of the shogunate was tested by internal struggles for power. The Eiji clan, a powerful samurai family related to the Minamoto through Yoritomo's wife Masako, gradually assumed control of the shogunate's administrative functions. Their position as regents, or shikin, allowed them to wield de facto power, effectively governing in the name of the shogun and further centralizing authority away from the Minamoto main line. This consolidation of Hajj power was viewed with suspicion and resentment by the imperial court, which saw an opportunity to reassert its own authority, while the shogunate was in a state of political transition. The audacious attempt to reclaim political power came from the retired Emperor Go-Toba, a cunning and ambitious monarch who had never fully accepted the samurai's dominance. Go-Toba sought to dismantle the shogunate and restore direct imperial rule, leveraging the discontent of various aristocratic and warrior factions who chafed under Kamakura's control. In 1221, he issued a proclamation calling for the overthrow of the Meiji Regency, a move that initiated a brief but pivotal conflict known as the Jaiki War. His call to arms was met with some support, but the vast majority of the nation's samurai remained loyal to the Hajj and the stability of the Kamakura shogunate. The Heiji clan, led by Heiji Masako, Yoritomo's widow and a powerful political figure in her own right, responded to the imperial challenge with speed and decisive action. Her famous speech to the assembled samurai, invoking the memory of Yoritomo and reminding them of their debts of gratitude, rallied the troops and cemented their loyalty to the shogunate. The shogunal forces marched on Kyoto, and in a swift campaign they overwhelmed the emperor's supporters and captured the capital. The military strength of the Kamakura government proved to be far superior to the emperor's coalition of disaffected samurai and court officials. The aftermath of the Jaiki War had profound and lasting consequences. The shogunate's victory was total. Emperor Go-Toba was exiled, and his close relatives were removed from the line of succession. The Meiji clan appointed a new, more pliant emperor and established new military and administrative officers, including the Rokuhara Tandai, to police the imperial court and control all affairs in Kyoto. This victory confirmed the samurai's absolute political dominance over the imperial court, effectively reducing the emperor to a symbolic figurehead and solidifying a new political order that would endure for centuries. The Meiji Regency, now undisputed masters of Japan, would continue to rule for another 100 years. The political stability established by the Hajj Regency following the Jaiki War was soon tested by a threat of unprecedented scale and origin: the Mongol Empire. Under the leadership of Kublai Khan, the Mongols had established a vast continental empire that stretched across Asia, and by the late 13th century, their expansionist gaze turned toward Japan. Beginning in 1268, Kublai Khan sent a series of envoys demanding that Japan become a tributary state. The Kamakura shogunate, confident in its military superiority and unwilling to submit to a foreign power, rejected these demands and executed the Mongol envoys. This act of defiance precipitated two massive invasion attempts that would prove to be the greatest external threat Japan had ever faced. The first invasion occurred in 1274, when a Mongol fleet of approximately 900 ships, carrying around 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers from a coalition of Mongol, Korean, and Chinese forces, landed in Hakata Bay. The Mongol army's tactics and weaponry were vastly different from those of the Japanese samurai. While the samurai traditionally engaged in single combat and relied on their swords and archery, the Mongols fought in coordinated units, using disciplined volleys of arrows and an array of sophisticated siege weapons and gunpowder-based explosives. This initial clash caught the Japanese samurai off guard, and their traditional tactics proved largely ineffective against the superior organization and firepower of the Mongol army. Despite their initial difficulties, the samurai's fierce resistance and deep knowledge of the local terrain eventually halted the Mongol advance. However, the true turning point came not from military might but from natural forces. A powerful typhoon struck the Mongol fleet while it was anchored in Hakata Bay, destroying a significant portion of their ships and forcing a disorganized retreat. The Japanese, attributing this event to divine intervention, called the storm kamikaze, or divine wind. The Mongols attempted a second, much larger invasion in 1281. This time, their fleet was estimated to be over 4,000 ships, carrying more than 140,000 soldiers. The Japanese, having learned from the first invasion, had spent the intervening years preparing their defences, constructing a 2-metre-high stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, and mobilizing a massive army of samurai from across the nation. The samurai, now more familiar with Mongol tactics, were able to mount a more effective and organized defense. However, once again, a powerful typhoon proved to be the decisive factor. A massive storm, far more devastating than the first, struck the Mongol fleet, scattering their ships and causing a catastrophic loss of life and equipment. The second invasion was a complete failure, and Japan's independence was secured. While the samurai's valor had preserved the nation, the immense cost of the wars, both in resources and manpower, contributed to a deep economic strain. The shogunate's inability to reward its warriors with new lands, as there was no territory to be conquered, led to rising discontent and a weakening of the Kamakura government's authority. The two Mongol invasions, while ultimately repelled, set in motion a series of political and economic challenges that the Kamakura shogunate was ill-equipped to handle, leading to its gradual and irreversible decline. The immense cost of defending the nation, both in resources and manpower, had placed a significant financial burden on the government. The samurai, who had fought valiantly for years, were accustomed to being rewarded with land and titles from conquered territories. However, since the Mongol invasions were a defensive war, there were no new lands to be seized. The Eiji Regency, now in a difficult position, was unable to provide its warriors with the tangible rewards they expected, leading to a profound sense of disillusionment and financial strain among the samurai class. This economic turmoil was exacerbated by the HJ clan's increasingly autocratic rule. The clan had solidified its power by appointing its members to key positions, but this policy alienated other powerful samurai families and regional lords who felt that their contributions to the war effort were not being properly recognized. The Eiji's attempt to centralize power further by creating a new council, the Hijesh, was seen by many as a way to sideline traditional samurai leaders and consolidate authority in their own hands. This growing concentration of power, coupled with the shogunate's inability to manage the post-war economic crisis, led to a growing chorus of dissent and a questioning of the government's legitimacy. The financial difficulties faced by the samurai were widespread. Many had mortgaged their lands to finance their military preparations and participation in the invasions. With no new rewards coming from the shogunate, they were often unable to repay their debts, and their land was seized by moneylenders or powerful provincial families. In an attempt to address this, the shogunate enacted the Tokusei Rei, or Acts of Grace, which cancelled debts and returned land to samurai. While this was intended to help, it ultimately destabilized the economy and further eroded the government's credibility among both samurai and merchants. These internal divisions provided a unique opportunity for the imperial court to attempt to reassert its authority. Emperor Go-Daigo, a shrewd and ambitious monarch, saw the widespread discontent as a chance to dismantle the shogunate and restore direct imperial rule. He began to secretly plot against the Ichei clan, gathering support from disillusioned samurai, Buddhist monasteries, and influential regional lords. the emperor's call to arms provided a focal point for the growing opposition to the Kamakura government, setting the stage for a period of profound civil strife and the final, bloody confrontation that would bring an end to the Kamakura shogunate. Emperor Go-Daigo, a shrewd and ambitious monarch, saw the Kamakura shogunate's decline as a unique opportunity to restore the emperor to a position of genuine political power. He began secretly plotting to overthrow the Hajj regency, gathering support from disillusioned samurai, disgruntled Buddhist monasteries, and regional lords who chafed under the shogunate's rule. His call to arms was met with the crucial support of powerful samurai, like Kusunoki Masashige and Ashikaga Takauji, whose combined military might proved decisive. Ashikaga Takauji, a prominent general in the Hajj army, defected to the emperor's side, turning the tide of the conflict. His defection, combined with the emperor's popular appeal, led to the swift fall of the Hajj clan and the end of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. With the Ha clan defeated, Emperor Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto and initiated a new era of direct imperial rule, known as the Meiji Restoration. This was a radical experiment in governance, as Go-Daigo attempted to dismantle the centuries-old shogunate system and place all political and military authority in the hands of the imperial court. He abolished the shogunate's administrative officers and implemented a new system based on the principles of the ancient Ritsuri system, attempting to rewind the political clock by more than 100 years. However, the Meiji Restoration proved to be a fleeting and ultimately failed experiment. Go-Daigo's policies were deeply unpopular with the samurai class, the very forces that had helped him to power. He failed to properly reward his samurai allies with the land and titles they expected, instead favoring court nobles and Buddhist monks in his appointments. This created a profound sense of betrayal among the warrior class, who had fought and bled for the restoration only to find themselves marginalized once again. Ashikaga Takauji, the very general who had led the charge against the Heijei, was particularly disgruntled with the emperor's policies and felt his contributions were unappreciated. This widespread samurai discontent led to a swift and brutal backlash. Ashikaga Takauji, now the most powerful samurai in the nation, turned against Emperor Go-Daigo, seizing Kyoto and driving the emperor to the south. In 1336, Takauji installed a new emperor, a member of a different imperial line, and established his own shogunate. This act plunged Japan into a new and even more complex civil war, the Namboku period, or the era of southern and northern courts. For the next 50 years, two rival imperial courts, one in the south under Emperor Go-Daigo and another in the north under Ashikaga Takauji's chosen emperor, vied for legitimacy. This protracted conflict, fueled by shifting samurai loyalties and political opportunism, plunged Japan into a state of continuous warfare, with the samurai firmly in control of the nation's destiny. The protracted civil strife of the Namboku period, which saw two rival imperial courts vying for legitimacy, ultimately came to an end with the unification of the imperial lines in 1392. This resolution was largely orchestrated by the Ashikaga clan, who had, since the initial defection of Ashikaga Takauji, been the dominant military power in Japan. The new military government, or Bakufu, was formally established in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, a location that reflected a significant departure from the Kamakura shogunate's provincial base. Placing the shogunate in the cultural heart of the nation brought the warrior class into direct and sustained contact with the aristocratic culture of the Heian court, fostering a unique synthesis of martial and aesthetic values that would define the era. Unlike its predecessor, the Ashikaga shogunate never achieved the same degree of centralized control. The Shugo daimyo, Powerful provincial lords who had been instrumental in the Ashikaga's rise retained significant military and economic autonomy. This decentralized structure meant that while the shogun was the official head of the government, true power was often distributed among these regional leaders, a condition that would eventually lead to the collapse of the shogunate's authority. The early Ashikaga shoguns, particularly Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, focused on both political and cultural pursuits, seeking to legitimize their rule not only through military might, but also through their patronage of the arts. This period, known as the Muromachi period, presided over a remarkable cultural flourishing that was deeply influenced by the tenets of Zen Buddhism. Zen, which had been introduced to Japan earlier, gained widespread appeal among the samurai class for its emphasis on discipline, simplicity, and the pursuit of enlightenment through direct experience. These values resonated profoundly with the samurai ethos, providing a spiritual and intellectual framework for a class transitioning from an era of continuous warfare to one of more formal ceremonial governance. The aesthetic principles of Zen Buddhism gave rise to some of Japan's most iconic art forms. The tranquil beauty of karasansui, or rock gardens, with their minimalist arrangements of rocks, sand, and moss, reflected the Zen pursuit of inner peace and meditation. Similarly, sumi-e, or inkwash painting, became a favored art form, as its spare and elegant lines mirrored the Zen ideal of stripping away excess to reveal the essential. The tea ceremony, or hanoyu, also flourished during this time, transforming from a simple act of drinking tea into a complex, ritualized performance that embodied the principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. These traditions were not mere pastimes. They were integral to the samurai's new identity, blending the rigorous discipline of the warrior with the refined sensibilities of the courtier, and creating a unique cultural legacy that would forever be associated with the samurai way of life. The decentralized power structure of the Ashikaga shogunate, which relied on the support of powerful provincial lords known as shugo daimyo, contained the seeds of its own destruction. While the early shoguns, like Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, were able to maintain a fragile balance of power, the shogunate's authority gradually weakened over the course of the 15th century. This simmering instability finally erupted into open warfare over a seemingly minor dispute regarding the shogunal succession. The 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, failed to produce an heir, and his decision to adopt his brother, Ashikaga Yoshimi, as his successor was challenged when his wife, Hino Tomiko, unexpectedly gave birth to a son, Yoshihisa. This dynastic dispute pitted two of the most powerful Shugo daimyo families against each other, the Yamana and the Hosokawa. The conflict, known as the Nin War, began in 1467. While the succession dispute was the initial catalyst, the war was a manifestation of deeper resentments and rivalries that had been building for decades among the provincial lords. The war was fought primarily within the city of Kyoto, which for over a decade became a battlefield for two massive armies. The city's sophisticated architecture, temples, and aristocratic estates were systematically destroyed in a brutal conflict that shattered the capital's prestige and cultural dominance. The fighting was not about decisive battles, but about a war of attrition, with rival factions building fortifications and engaging in a prolonged, bloody stalemate. The Nin War's most profound consequence was the complete collapse of the central government's authority. The shogun, caught in the middle of the conflict, was powerless to stop the fighting, and his authority evaporated as the provincial lords fought for their own interests. The war effectively ended the Ashikaga shogunate's ability to govern, leaving a power vacuum that unleashed the full forces of regional ambition. The end of the war in 1477 did not bring peace. It simply marked the beginning of a more widespread and brutal struggle for power. The aftermath of the Nin War saw the complete disintegration of Japan into a collection of independent, warring states ruled by ambitious daimyo. This new political reality, known as the Sengoku Jidai, or Age of the Country at War, was characterized by a ruthless struggle for survival and dominance. The old loyalties of the shogunate system were replaced by a new social order, known as Gekkokuge, the low overthrowing the high, in which ambitious, low-ranking samurai could seize power and land from their superiors. The era was defined by constant military innovation, the construction of massive stone castles, and a relentless pursuit of power that would continue until the emergence of three great unifiers who would eventually bring an end to the chaos. The Nin War's effective dismantling of the Ashikaga shogunate's central authority ushered in a new and profoundly different era of Japanese history. With the shogun's power shattered, the traditional ties of loyalty that had defined the feudal system for centuries were replaced by a ruthless Darwinian struggle for survival and dominance. The provinces, no longer subject to a central government, became a collection of independent warring states, each ruled by an ambitious provincial warlord. This was the Sengoku Jidai, a period of unrelenting conflict and social upheaval. The central figures of this new political reality were the daimyo, a term meaning great names. These were not the hereditary Shugo daimyo of the previous era, who had owed some degree of fealty to the shogun. Instead, the new Sengoku daimyo were provincial warlords who operated with complete autonomy, forging alliances, betraying rivals, and expanding their territories through ceaseless warfare. Their power was not derived from ancient lineage or imperial decree, but from their own military might and administrative ability. The most successful daimyo were those who could effectively manage their domain's resources, raise and maintain large armies, and outmaneuver their rivals through a combination of strategic cunning and battlefield prowess. This period was characterized by a new social order known as Gekkokuge, the low overthrowing the high, where ambitious, low-ranking samurai could seize power and land from their superiors. This phenomenon shattered the rigid social hierarchy of the previous eras and created a meritocratic, albeit brutal, environment. A samurai's worth was no longer determined by their family name, but by their military achievements and political acumen. This emphasis on individual ability redefined the samurai ethos, prioritizing strategic cunning and military effectiveness over inherited rank or ancient lineage. The relentless nature of this conflict drove significant military innovation. The daimyo began to build massive stone castles, which served as both the political heart of their domain and as formidable military strongholds. The art of siege warfare became a central feature of military strategy, and the design of these castles reflected a sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. Furthermore, the armies of this period were no longer composed solely of elite samurai. Daimyo began to conscript large numbers of peasant foot soldiers, or ashigaru, who were armed with spears and, later, with firearms. These larger, multi-unit armies required a new level of military administration and logistics, and the most successful daimyo were those who could effectively manage these complex operations. This chaotic period of constant warfare would not end until the emergence of three great unifiers: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would eventually bring an end to the chaos and rebuild the nation under a new, centralized government. The relentless and widespread conflict of the Sengoku Jidai, in which provincial warlords operated with complete autonomy, was the primary catalyst for a wave of military innovation that fundamentally changed the art of war in Japan. The era's continuous struggle for survival and dominance spurred a transition away from the traditional small-scale engagements of the past and towards a new, more efficient, and often more brutal form of military conflict. The days of single combat between samurai champions, while still honored in principle, became a rarity on the battlefield, replaced by large-scale, coordinated military maneuvers. The composition of armies underwent a radical change. Whereas previous conflicts had relied on a core of elite samurai, the new warfare demanded a scale of manpower that could no longer be met by the samurai class alone. Daimyo began to conscript large numbers of peasant foot soldiers, known as ashigaru. These soldiers, armed with long spears, yari, and, later, with firearms, were trained to fight in disciplined formations. The ashigaru were not skilled warriors like the samurai, but their sheer numbers, low cost, and specialized roles made them an indispensable component of the new armies. This integration of a non-samurai fighting force shifted battlefield tactics, with massed spear formations and coordinated volleys of arrows becoming crucial for success. This new military reality demanded a different kind of leadership. The most successful daimyo were no longer simply the bravest or most skilled swordsmen. They were brilliant military administrators and logistical experts. Commanding a massive army composed of diverse units from elite samurai to conscripted foot soldiers required a sophisticated understanding of logistics, supply chains, and training. Daimyo were responsible for managing the production of weapons, the construction of fortifications, and the provisioning of tens of thousands of soldiers in the field. The scale of these operations, which included the construction of massive stone castles as political and military centers, required a new level of administrative acumen. Siege warfare also became a central feature of military strategy. As daimyo built increasingly formidable castles to protect their domains, the ability to capture these strongholds became paramount. The art of siege warfare, involving the use of complex earthworks, sapping, and siege weapons, developed rapidly during this period. The design of these castles, with their multiple layers of walls, moats, and intricate gate systems, reflected this sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and military engineering. The daimyo's power was now inextricably linked to their ability to build and defend these powerful symbols of their authority. This era of conflict, defined by its relentless innovation and the rise of a new kind of military leadership, would not end until the emergence of three great unifiers who would use these new methods of warfare to forge a unified nation. The relentless and widespread conflict of the Sengoku Jidai, in which provincial warlords operated with complete autonomy, was the primary catalyst for a wave of military innovation that fundamentally changed the art of war in Japan. The era's continuous struggle for survival and dominance spurred a transition away from the traditional small-scale engagements of the past and towards a new, more efficient, and often more brutal form of military conflict. The days of single combat between samurai champions, while still honored in principle, became a rarity on the battlefield, replaced by large-scale, coordinated military maneuvers. The composition of armies underwent a radical change. Whereas previous conflicts had relied on a core of elite samurai, the new warfare demanded a scale of manpower that could no longer be met by the samurai class alone. Daimyo began to conscript large numbers of peasant foot soldiers, known as ashigaru. These soldiers, armed with long spears yari and, later, with firearms, were trained to fight in disciplined formations. The ashigaru were not skilled warriors like the samurai, but their sheer numbers, low cost, and specialized roles made them an indispensable component of the new armies. This integration of a non-samurai fighting force shifted battlefield tactics, with massed spear formations and coordinated volleys of arrows becoming crucial for success. This new military reality demanded a different kind of leadership. The most successful daimyo were no longer simply the bravest or most skilled swordsmen. They were brilliant military administrators and logistical experts. Commanding a massive army composed of diverse units from elite samurai to conscripted foot soldiers required a sophisticated understanding of logistics, supply chains, and training. Daimyo were responsible for managing the production of weapons, the construction of fortifications, and the provisioning of tens of thousands of soldiers in the field. The scale of these operations, which included the construction of massive stone castles as political and military centers, required a new level of administrative acumen. Siege warfare also became a central feature of military strategy. As daimyo built increasingly formidable castles to protect their domains, the ability to capture these strongholds became paramount. The art of siege warfare, involving the use of complex earthworks, sapping, and siege weapons, developed rapidly during this period. The design of these castles, with their multiple layers of walls, moats, and intricate gate systems, reflected this sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and military engineering. The daimyo's power was now inextricably linked to their ability to build and defend these powerful symbols of their authority. This era of conflict, defined by its relentless innovation and the rise of a new kind of military leadership, would not end until the emergence of three great unifiers who would use these new methods of warfare to forge a unified nation. The arrival of Portuguese traders on the shores of Tanegashima in 1543 was an event that would irrevocably alter the course of Japanese military history. Among the exotic goods they brought with them were a new type of weapon known as the arquebus, a matchlock firearm that possessed a destructive power and ease of use that defied traditional samurai standards. Initially, these weapons were met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The Japanese, with their centuries-old tradition of honor-bound swordsmanship and disciplined archery, were deeply invested in the personal skill and martial prowess that defined the warrior class. The gun, which allowed a peasant to kill an armored samurai from a distance with relatively little training, was viewed by many as a dishonorable and unrefined instrument of war. However, the pragmatism of the Sengoku Jidai, an era defined by a ruthless struggle for survival, quickly superseded traditional values. The gun's effectiveness in battle, particularly in massed volleys, was not lost on astute daimyo. The firearm's ability to penetrate samurai armor and its psychological impact on the battlefield were undeniable advantages. Daimyo quickly began to acquire the new technology, either by purchasing the guns from Portuguese and later Dutch traders, or by reverse engineering and mass-producing them locally. The Sakai and Kunitomo gunsmiths became renowned for their ability to replicate and improve upon the foreign designs, turning the arquebus from a foreign novelty into a standard component of Japanese warfare. The most prominent and successful adopter of this new technology was Oda Nobunaga. He recognized that the gun was not just a new weapon, but a new way of waging war. Nobunaga was one of the first leaders to fully integrate firearms into his army, creating specialized units of Ashigaru gunners. He developed and implemented revolutionary tactics, such as the famous three-rank volley firing system, which allowed his soldiers to deliver a continuous barrage of gunfire, overwhelming opponents who were still reliant on traditional swords and spears. These tactics were first used to devastating effect at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, where Nobunaga's gunners, positioned behind a wooden palisade, decimated the legendary cavalry charges of the Takeda clan. The introduction of firearms fundamentally changed the nature of the battlefield. The focus shifted from individual heroic combat to coordinated, disciplined unit tactics. The emphasis on individual martial skill was diminished in favor of the collective power of massed firepower. This transition in military strategy had a profound effect on the samurai ethos, as the traditional ideals of honor and valor in a one-on-one duel were slowly replaced by a brutal pragmatism that prioritized military effectiveness above all else. The gun was instrumental in ending the chaotic era of the Sengoku Jidai, and its widespread adoption provided the military power necessary for the three great unifiers to forge a new, centralized Japan. The chaotic and brutal era of the Sengoku Jidai, characterized by ceaseless warfare and a shattered central government, was a landscape ripe for a leader of extraordinary ambition and military genius. The first of the three great unifiers to emerge from this turmoil was Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 in the humble province of Owari, Nobunaga was initially regarded as a reckless and eccentric young lord, a reputation that earned him the moniker the Great Fool of Owari. However, this image belied a brilliant and ruthless tactician who possessed an insatiable ambition to not only conquer, but to fundamentally restructure Japan. Nobunaga's rise was predicated on a series of calculated and often revolutionary moves that set him apart from his rivals. He was one of the first daimyo to recognize the transformative potential of firearms, and he moved quickly to acquire and mass-produce arquebuses, which he integrated into his army with unprecedented discipline. His military innovations were not limited to technology. He developed revolutionary battlefield tactics, such as the famous three-rank volley firing system, which allowed his soldiers to deliver a continuous barrage of gunfire. This strategic foresight and willingness to break with centuries of samurai tradition gave him a decisive advantage over opponents who were still reliant on traditional swords and spears. Nobunaga's aggressive expansionism was driven by his vision of a unified, centralized Japan, free from the fragmented power of the feudal system. His famous personal seal, emblazoned with the words Tenka Fubu, "Rule the empire by force," was a clear declaration of his intent. He was a master of political maneuvering, forging strategic alliances, and exploiting the weaknesses of his rivals with ruthless efficiency. His campaigns were not just about military conquest, they were about dismantling the old power structures that had held Japan in a state of civil war for over a century. His most audacious political act was the systematic destruction of the politically active Buddhist monasteries, which had long operated as powerful, independent military and economic forces. Nobunaga saw these institutions as a direct threat to his authority, and his bloody siege of Mount Hiei, which resulted in the annihilation of thousands of warrior monks, was a calculated act of terror intended to demonstrate that no power, whether secular or religious, would be allowed to stand in the way of his quest for absolute control. Through a combination of revolutionary military tactics and an unyielding will to centralize power, Nobunaga's rise demonstrated that a new era of military-enforced order was about to be forged from the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, and he would lay the essential foundation for his successors to complete the work of building a new, unified Japan. The early career of Oda Nobunaga was marked by a constant struggle to consolidate control over his home province of Owari, a feat that he had only recently achieved. However, his control was tenuous, and he was quickly faced with a formidable external threat in the form of Imagawa Yoshimoto, a powerful daimyo who ruled the provinces of Suruga, Tie-Ent-Mi, and Mikawa. In 1560, Yoshimoto assembled a massive army, numbering over 25,000 soldiers, with the stated intention of marching on the capital of Kyoto and seizing control of the nation. The path to the capital lay directly through Nobunaga's lands. Against this overwhelming force, Nobunaga could only muster an army of approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men. A conventional military engagement would have meant certain defeat. Faced with this impossible situation, Nobunaga's military genius was first put on full display at the Battle of Okahazama. Instead of attempting to defend his territory in a direct confrontation, Nobunaga employed a brilliant and audacious strategy of deception and surprise. He deliberately left his main castle, Kiyosu Castle, lightly defended, creating the impression that he was preparing to mount a desperate last-stand defense. While Imagawa Yoshimoto's massive army was resting after a victory at a nearby fortress, Nobunaga secretly moved his troops through the dense forest, an action that was completely unexpected by his overconfident opponent. Nobunaga's strategy was built on a series of calculated maneuvers designed to mislead Imagawa's forces and create a window of opportunity for a surprise attack. He used a variety of tactics to confuse his enemy, including the strategic use of banners and decoys to make his forces appear larger than they were. He then launched a swift and devastating assault on Imagawa's command post, which was located in a narrow gorge, an action that caught the enemy completely off guard. The surprise attack, launched during a sudden downpour, caused chaos and confusion in the Mongol camp. Imagawa Yoshimoto himself was killed in the chaos, a stunning and pivotal event that led to the complete disintegration of his army. The Battle of Okahazama was a stunning victory that had profound consequences. It not only solidified Nobunaga's control over his home province of Owari, but also established his reputation as a brilliant, unpredictable, and ruthless commander. The victory demonstrated his willingness to defy military conventions and his ability to achieve victory against impossible odds. This audacious triumph marked the beginning of Nobunaga's meteoric rise to power, providing him with the momentum and legitimacy he needed to begin his campaign to unify Japan. The death of Imagawa Yoshimoto also created a power vacuum in the surrounding provinces, which Nobunaga was quick to exploit, paving the way for his ambitious expansionism. With his control over Owari and his reputation established, Oda Nobunaga embarked on a systematic campaign of centralization aimed at dismantling the traditional feudal structure and consolidating power under his direct command. He was the first of the great unifiers to recognize that the fragmented authority of the Sengoku Jidai could not be resolved by simply replacing one shogun with another. It required a complete and ruthless restructuring of the entire political landscape. Nobunaga's famous slogan, "Rule the empire by force," was not just a military boast, but a political manifesto that guided his actions as he expanded his domain. Nobunaga's approach to governance was defined by a brutal pragmatism that placed military effectiveness and centralized authority above all else. He was the first to implement a new form of land management, the kenchi, or land survey, which aimed to create a more efficient and accurate tax base. This process allowed him to bypass the traditional daimyo and their retainers, collecting taxes directly from the farmers and effectively breaking the economic power of his rivals. He also pursued a policy of separating the warrior and the farmer, officially disarming the peasant class and ensuring that military power was concentrated solely in the hands of the samurai. His most audacious and controversial move was the systematic dismantling of the powerful Buddhist monasteries, which had long operated as independent military and economic entities. Institutions like the Enryakuji on Mount Hiei, home to the Tendai sect, had amassed vast land holdings and commanded armies of warrior monks, posing a direct threat to Nobunaga's authority. These monasteries were not just religious centers, they were formidable political rivals, with the ability to influence alliances and challenge a daimyo's rule. Nobunaga saw these institutions as an obstacle to his vision of a unified secular state. His response was a calculated act of terror. In 1571, he launched a massive siege of Mount Hiei, which had supported his rivals. His army, using firearms to devastating effect, systematically burned the monastery complexes to the ground and massacred thousands of monks, civilians, and children. The destruction was so complete that the area would not be rebuilt for years. The bloody siege of Mount Hiei was a shocking and unprecedented act that sent a clear message to all of Japan. No power, whether secular or religious, would be allowed to stand in the way of his quest for absolute control. Through this act and others, Nobunaga demonstrated that a new era of military-enforced order was about to be forged from the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai. The destruction of the monastery complexes on Mount Hiei in 1571 was a pivotal and defining event in Oda Nobunaga's campaign for national unification. The monastery of Enryaku-ji, which housed the Tendai sect, had been a powerful political and military force for centuries, possessing vast landholdings and an army of warrior monks. The institution's authority had long been protected by its religious sanctity, but Nobunaga saw it as a direct obstacle to his vision of a unified, centralized, and secular state. He was a ruthless pragmatist who recognized that traditional religious power had to be broken if he was to impose a new political order. Nobunaga's siege of Mount Hiei was a calculated act of terror intended to send an unequivocal message to all of Japan. His army, utilizing disciplined formations and a high concentration of firearms, surrounded the mountain and its numerous complexes. The attack was swift and brutal. Nobunaga's forces systematically burned every temple, pagoda, and living quarter to the ground, destroying not only the physical center of the Tendai sect, but also centuries of priceless art, literature, and religious artifacts. The massacre of thousands of monks, their families, and local villagers who had sought refuge in the temples was a shocking and unprecedented act that reverberated throughout Japan. The significance of this act extended far beyond a simple military victory. The destruction of Mount Hiei was a brutal declaration of Nobunaga's new secular authority, demonstrating that he would not respect traditional religious and political boundaries in his quest for unification. It was a clear rejection of the old fragmented order, and a statement that no power, whether sacred or secular, would be allowed to operate independently of his rule. The massacre served to break the political influence of the warrior monks for the remainder of the Sengoku Jidai. The guiding philosophy behind these ruthless actions was encapsulated in Nobunaga's personal seal, emblazoned with the words Tenka Fubu, translated as "Rule the empire by force." It was more than just a military slogan. It was a political manifesto that signaled his intention to unify the nation by any means necessary, and to replace the old order, which had been defined by a fragile balance of power, with a new one founded on military might and absolute control. The seal became the symbol of his brutal pragmatism and his ambition to create a unified Japan under a single, powerful authority. Nobunaga's actions at Mount Hiei and the philosophy of Tenka Fubu that guided them demonstrated that a new era of military-enforced order was about to be forged from the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, and he was the one who would lay the foundation for its creation. By the early 1580s, Oda Nobunaga was at the apex of his power. He had systematically dismantled the authority of the traditional daimyo, crushed the independent power of the Buddhist monasteries, and controlled most of central Japan. His campaign for national unification was nearing its completion, and his revolutionary military tactics, which relied heavily on firearms, had proven to be decisively superior to those of his rivals. With his main opponents subdued, Nobunaga began preparing for a final climactic campaign to consolidate his rule over the remaining independent territories in western Japan. At this point, he was not only the most powerful warlord in the nation, but also the undisputed master of a new, centralized military state. However, Nobunaga's ruthless pragmatism and dictatorial style had also created a climate of fear and resentment among his subordinates. He was known for his quick temper, his public humiliation of his generals, and his willingness to discard anyone he deemed to be an obstacle to his ambitions. This environment of distrust, coupled with his meteoric rise, created a vulnerability that would prove to be his undoing. While Nobunaga was preparing for his final campaigns, he was betrayed by one of his most trusted and capable generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. In the summer of 1582, Nobunaga was staying at the Honji Temple in Kyoto, with only a small number of guards. Akechi Mitsuhide, who had been ordered to lead his forces in a campaign in western Japan, instead turned his army back to the capital and launched a surprise attack on the temple. The reason for Mitsuhide's betrayal remains one of the great mysteries of Japanese history. Some historians suggest it was a personal grievance against Nobunaga, while others believe it was an act of political opportunism. Regardless of the motive, the attack was swift and devastating. Outnumbered and caught completely off guard, Nobunaga's small force was quickly overwhelmed. To avoid capture and the dishonor of being killed by a traitor, Nobunaga committed ritual suicide or seppuku. The assassination at Hon-ji was a sudden and shocking end to Nobunaga's grand ambition. With his death, the nation was once again plunged into temporary chaos as his generals scrambled to avenge him and seize control of the nation. The incident demonstrated the fragility of the new military-enforced order that Nobunaga had created and sent a clear message that personal loyalty was still a potent and often unpredictable force in Japanese politics. However, Nobunaga's legacy was secure. He had laid the essential foundation for unification, paving the way for his successors to complete the work of building a new, centralized Japan. His revolutionary military tactics, administrative reforms, and dismantling of the old feudal order provided the blueprint for a unified nation, and it was a blueprint that his most capable general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, would quickly and effectively follow. The assassination of Oda Nobunaga at Hon-ji in 1582 created a sudden and dangerous power vacuum. The nation, which had been on the verge of unification, was once again plunged into chaos as Nobunaga's top generals vied for the mantle of his successor. From the ashes of this turmoil emerged Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of humble origins who had risen to become one of Nobunaga's most trusted and capable generals. Hideyoshi's background was unique among the great unifiers. Born a peasant, he lacked samurai lineage and the inherited status that came with it. This lack of a traditional power base meant he had to rely entirely on his strategic brilliance, political cunning, and his personal charisma to consolidate power. At the time of Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi was engaged in a campaign against the Meiji clan in western Japan. Upon receiving the news of the assassination, he immediately concluded a hasty and favorable peace treaty with the Meiji and began a forced march back to the capital. This strategic maneuver, known as the Great Return, was a masterful display of military speed and decisive action, covering a distance of over 100 miles in a matter of days. Hideyoshi's speed allowed him to arrive in the capital before any of his rivals, an act that was critical to his claim as Nobunaga's true successor. Hideyoshi's swift and decisive revenge against the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki was the final act that cemented his position. With a large army, Hideyoshi crushed Mitsuhide's forces just 13 days after Nobunaga's death. The battle was a resounding victory, and Mitsuhide was killed as he attempted to escape. Hideyoshi's rapid and successful retaliation earned him immense prestige and the moral high ground, allowing him to present himself as the rightful avenger of his master's death. With Mitsuhide eliminated, Hideyoshi faced opposition from other powerful generals, including Shibata Katsue, who believed he had a more legitimate claim to Nobunaga's legacy. Hideyoshi, however, outmaneuvered his rivals both politically and militarily. At the Battle of Shizugatake, he defeated Shibata Katsue's forces in a strategic campaign that showcased his tactical brilliance. With his rivals either defeated or co-opted, Hideyoshi consolidated his control over Nobunaga's former territories and began the process of bringing the remaining daimyo under his rule. He was granted a new surname, Toyotomi, by the emperor, and was given the title of Kampaku, or imperial regent, a prestigious position that provided him with the official legitimacy he lacked through lineage. Through a combination of military force and astute political maneuvering, Hideyoshi had risen from a humble peasant to the de facto ruler of Japan, ready to complete the unification that Nobunaga had started. The swift and decisive military action of Toyotomi Hideyoshi following the assassination of Oda Nobunaga was the defining event that cemented his rise to power. His forced march back to the capital, known as the Great Return, allowed him to arrive in a position of strategic advantage before any of Nobunaga's other generals. This speed and a keen understanding of political timing enabled him to act as the primary avenger of his master's death, a critical step in establishing his claim to leadership. The opportunity for a decisive confrontation came just 13 days after the assassination at the Battle of Yamazaki. The battle took place in the Yamazaki region, a strategic location between the provinces of Kyoto and Osaka. Akechi Mitsuhide's forces, demoralized by the lack of support from other daimyo and facing the logistical challenge of holding the capital, were caught off guard by the speed of Hideyoshi's advance. Hideyoshi, with a significantly larger army and the moral high ground of avenging Nobunaga, was able to secure a decisive victory. His forces crushed Mitsuhide's army, and Mitsuhide himself was killed as he attempted to escape. This resounding triumph earned Hideyoshi immense prestige and the political legitimacy he needed to present himself as the rightful successor to Nobunaga. With Mitsuhide eliminated, Hideyoshi faced opposition from other powerful generals, most notably Shibata Katsue, who had served Nobunaga for decades and believed he had a more legitimate claim to the mantle of leadership. The rivalry between them was a crucial test of Hideyoshi's ability to govern. Hideyoshi, however, outmaneuvered his rivals both politically and militarily. At the Battle of Shizugatake, he used a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological warfare to defeat Shibata Katsue's forces in a strategic campaign that showcased his tactical brilliance. Katsui was defeated, and the remaining resistance to Hideyoshi's authority was swiftly dismantled. Through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill, Hideyoshi gradually brought the remaining daimyo under his control. He did not seek to eliminate every rival, but rather offered them terms of surrender that were often generous, allowing them to retain their lands and titles in exchange for an oath of fealty. This pragmatic approach to unification allowed him to consolidate power without plunging the nation back into a prolonged civil war. He conducted a series of military campaigns, such as the conquest of the Shimazu clan in Kyushu and the Heijei clan in Odawara, which systematically brought all of Japan's provinces under his control. This period of consolidation officially ended the chaotic Sengoku Jidai and completed the unification of the nation that Nobunaga had started. Hideyoshi, the man of humble birth, had risen to become the undisputed master of Japan, and he would use his position to enact a series of sweeping reforms that would fundamentally restructure the nation. The unification of Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, following decades of internal conflict, created a nation with an immense and experienced military force. Having brought an end to the Sengoku Jidai, Hideyoshi's ambition was not confined to Japan's borders. He harbored a grand vision of conquering Korea and subsequently China, with the ultimate goal of establishing a Pan-Asian empire. His motivations were complex and are a subject of historical debate. Some historians argue that the invasions were a means to solidify his domestic power, keep the newly unified daimyo occupied, and reward his samurai with new lands and titles. Others suggest it was a manifestation of a deeply held and grandiose ambition. Regardless of the motivation, Hideyoshi's two massive invasions of the Korean peninsula would prove to be a costly and ultimately failed endeavor. The first invasion began in 1592. Hideyoshi assembled a massive army of approximately 160,000 soldiers, predominantly samurai, who had been battle-hardened during Japan's unification wars. This force, commanded by a coalition of daimyo, was far superior to the Korean army in terms of numbers and combat experience. The Japanese forces made swift progress, capturing major cities like Busan and the capital of Hansong, modern-day Seoul, with relative ease. The Korean army, caught unprepared and lacking modern weaponry, was unable to mount a coordinated defense. However, the Japanese advance was soon challenged on two fronts. The first was at sea, where the Korean Navy, under the brilliant command of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, used its superior ships, the famous turtle ships, and innovative naval tactics to repeatedly defeat the Japanese fleets. Admiral Yi's victories cut off Japanese supply lines, stranding their ground forces on the peninsula. The second major challenge came from Ming China, which sent a large army to support its tributary state of Korea. The Ming forces, with their large numbers and experience in continental warfare, effectively halted the Japanese advance and forced a prolonged, costly stalemate. The campaigns descended into a brutal war of attrition, marked by sieges, guerrilla warfare, and immense casualties on all sides. After a temporary truce, Hideyoshi launched a second invasion in 1597, but this effort was also met with fierce resistance from the combined Korean and Chinese forces. The campaigns ultimately proved to be a failure. They drained Japan's resources, alienated its allies, and resulted in immense casualties for the samurai class. The invasions, while demonstrating the immense military power of a unified Japan, left a legacy of bitterness and mistrust that would define Japan's relationship with Korea and China for centuries. They also contributed to the instability that followed Hideyoshi's death, as the power vacuum he left behind was exacerbated by the losses of his costly foreign wars. With Japan unified and his authority established, Toyotomi Hideyoshi turned his attention to consolidating his rule and preventing any future uprisings that might threaten his newly forged political order. The chaotic Sengoku Jidai had been defined by social mobility, with ambitious peasants able to rise through the ranks to become samurai. Hideyoshi, himself a product of this very system, now sought to permanently close the door on this social fluidity. To achieve this, he enacted a series of sweeping decrees, the most famous of which was the sword hunt. In 1588, this was a nationwide order that mandated the confiscation of all swords, spears, and firearms from farmers, merchants, and religious institutions across the country. The official pretext for the sword hunt was to use the confiscated metal to forge a massive statue of the great Buddha, a religious act that was meant to bring peace and prosperity to the nation. However, the true purpose of the decree was political and social. By disarming all non-samurai in the provinces, Hideyoshi sought to definitively separate the samurai class from the rest of the population. The sword, which had been a common instrument of self-defense and rebellion during the Sengoku Jidai, was now to be the exclusive symbol of the samurai class. This act was a pivotal moment in the creation of a rigid, four-tiered social hierarchy that would define Japanese society for the next 200 years. This new social order, known as the Mibunsei, was designed to place the samurai at the top of a pyramid of power and prestige. Below them were the farmers, who were considered the bedrock of the nation's economy. Next came the artisans and craftsmen, followed by the merchants at the very bottom. This system was not just a social classification, it was a legal and political framework that dictated every aspect of a person's life, from their clothing and occupation to their rights and responsibilities. By creating this rigid social structure, Hideyoshi aimed to eliminate the social mobility that had characterized the Sengoku Jidai, ensuring that military power remained concentrated solely in the hands of the samurai class. The sword hunt and the establishment of the Mibunsei were instrumental in pacifying the nation and securing the Toyotomi government's authority. The disarmed peasantry was no longer a credible military threat, and their energies were redirected toward agriculture and economic production. The samurai class, now the exclusive holders of military power, was transformed from a warrior elite to a governing class, with their status and prestige legally codified. This act of disarming the populace, combined with other reforms, created a stable social foundation that would be inherited by the next great unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and would become the defining feature of the long and peaceful Edo period. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598, following his costly and ultimately failed Korean campaigns, created a critical power vacuum that threatened to undo his life's work of unifying Japan. Hideyoshi, a man of humble birth who had risen to absolute power, lacked the samurai lineage to establish a dynasty through traditional means. His ambition to create a lasting Toyotomi legacy rested on his young son, Hideyori, who was only 5 years old at the time of his father's death. To ensure a stable succession and prevent the nation from reverting to the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, Hideyoshi created a complex political framework to govern in his absence. This was the Council of 5 Elders Goter and the Council of 5 Commissioners Gobyugi. The Council of 5 Elders was composed of the most powerful and influential daimyo in the nation, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, Maeda Toshie, Mairi Teramoto, Uesugi Kagekatsu, and Ukita Hidei. These men were chosen for their immense power and military strength, and their collective authority was intended to act as a check on any single elder's ambition. The Council of 5 Commissioners, a group of 5 senior administrators, was tasked with managing the day-to-day governance and executing the political decisions of the elders. This two-tiered system was a masterful piece of political engineering, designed to maintain a delicate balance of power and ensure the peaceful succession of Hideyoshi's son. However, the council was a fragile truce between competing ambitions, and its very structure was destined to fail. The deep-seated rivalries among the elders, particularly between Tokugawa Ieyasu and the others, began to surface immediately after Hideyoshi's death. Ieyasu, who was the most powerful and cunning of the elders, had a military and economic base that far exceeded that of his rivals. He had long been a patient observer, a master of strategic alliances and political maneuvering, and he saw in the council a perfect opportunity to achieve his own ambition of ruling the nation. Ieyasu began to systematically dismantle the council's authority, forging strategic alliances with a number of influential daimyo and a large number of former Toyotomi retainers. He used the Council of Commissioners to his advantage, co-opting some and sidelining others. The political vacuum left by Hideyoshi's passing was quickly and effectively filled by Ieyasu's growing power. The other elders, particularly Ishida Mitsunari, a staunch loyalist to the Toyotomi cause, began to grow suspicious of Ieyasu's actions. The conflict between them became a struggle for the very soul of the Toyotomi government, pitting those who wished to preserve Hideyoshi's legacy against the rising power of a single ambitious elder. This political maneuvering would eventually lead to the collapse of the council and a final, climactic confrontation that would decide the fate of Japan. The political vacuum left by the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 was a volatile and dangerous environment. While the Council of 5 Elders and 5 Commissioners was designed to ensure a peaceful transition of power to Hideyoshi's son, the inherent rivalries among its members made a future conflict inevitable. From a position of strategic patience and political cunning, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a former rival and reluctant ally of both Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, masterfully exploited this instability to achieve his own long-held ambition of ruling the nation. Ieyasu was a unique figure among the great unifiers. He had spent decades as a subordinate to both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, enduring hardship and loss while patiently building his own power base. This long period of service had taught him the value of patience, the importance of strategic alliances, and the necessity of political maneuvering. His domain in the Kant region was vast, wealthy, and strategically defensible, giving him a military and economic base that far exceeded that of any of his rivals. While other daimyo bickered and jockeyed for position on the Council of Elders, Ieyasu quietly consolidated his power, forging a network of critical alliances with influential daimyo and a large number of former Toyotomi retainers who were dissatisfied with the new government. Ieyasu's most formidable rival on the council was Ishida Mitsunari, a staunch loyalist to the Toyotomi cause who sought to preserve Hideyoshi's legacy. Ishida, however, was a courtly administrator who lacked the deep-seated loyalties of the daimyo and the battlefield experience of Ieyasu. This political and military disparity proved to be Ieyasu's greatest advantage. While Ishida worked to build a coalition against Ieyasu, he was unable to match Ieyasu's strategic cunning and his ability to leverage his immense power to win over wavering lords. Ieyasu's political maneuvers included forging marriage alliances with key daimyo and, in direct violation of Hideyoshi's will, forming alliances with Western daimyo who had been excluded from the council. Ieyasu's patient and methodical approach to consolidating power set the stage for the final climactic confrontation that would decide the fate of Japan. As Ishida Mitsunari's anti-Tokugawa coalition grew, so too did the number of daimyo who defected to Ieyasu's side. The conflict between them became a struggle for the very soul of the Toyotomi government, pitting those who wished to preserve Hideyoshi's legacy against the rising power of a single, ambitious elder. This political maneuvering would eventually lead to the collapse of the council and a final, epochal battle for the future of Japan, a confrontation that would bring an end to the long era of civil war and usher in a new age of peace under the rule of the Tokugawa clan. The political and military maneuvering that defined the years following the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi finally culminated in the largest and most decisive battle of the Sengoku Jidai. The nation was effectively divided into two massive coalitions: the Western Army, a coalition of daimyo loyal to the Toyotomi cause and led by Ishida Mitsunari, and the Eastern Army, commanded by Tokugawa Ieyasu. The two forces, numbering over 160,000 soldiers in total, met on October 21st, 1600, on a small plain near the village of Sekigahara, a strategic location that controlled the main roads to the capital. The Battle of Sekigahara was a struggle for the very future of Japan. Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army was numerically superior and held a strong defensive position on a series of hills surrounding the plain. However, the Western Army was a fragile coalition of daimyo, with competing loyalties and a lack of a unified command structure. Ieyasu's Eastern Army, in contrast, was a more cohesive force, bound by a shared loyalty to Ieyasu and a clear, unified objective. Ieyasu, a master of strategic cunning, had spent the months leading up to the battle forging a series of crucial alliances and undermining his opponent's coalition through a campaign of political intrigue and strategic negotiation. The battle itself was a tactical stalemate for much of the day, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The decisive turning point came from a series of well-timed betrayals from within the Western Army's ranks. Key daimyo, who had been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu before the battle, defected to the Eastern Army. The most pivotal of these betrayals came from Kobayakawa Hideaki, a general on the Western Army's right flank, who, after a signal from Ieyasu, turned his entire force against his allies. This sudden and unexpected attack created chaos and confusion in the Western Army's ranks, causing a complete disintegration of their defensive formation. Ieyasu's forces, seizing this opportunity, launched a final, devastating assault that overwhelmed the remaining pockets of resistance. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and later executed, and the Western army was completely defeated. The Battle of Sekigahara was a total victory for Tokugawa Ieyasu. This triumph officially ended the long and brutal age of the country at war and paved the way for the establishment of a new centralized government. In 1603, Ieyasu was formally appointed Sei Taishogun by the emperor, a title he would use to establish the Tokugawa shogunate. The establishment of this new military government inaugurated the peaceful Edo period, a 250-year era of unprecedented stability under absolute samurai rule. Following his decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu had effectively established himself as the ruler of Japan, but his position was not yet absolute. The greatest potential threat to the newly established Tokugawa shogunate was the continued existence of Toyotomi Hideori, the son of the late unifier Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyori, who was still a young man, resided in the formidable Osaka Castle, the last remaining symbol of the Toyotomi government. The immense wealth and prestige of the Toyotomi clan still commanded the loyalty of many daimyo who had fought against Ieyasu at Sekigahara. Ieyasu understood that as long as Hideyori was alive and surrounded by his loyalists, he remained a potential focal point for a future rebellion. To eliminate this threat without appearing to be a usurper, Ieyasu employed a cunning and methodical strategy. He first created a pretext for war by accusing Hideyori and his retainers of a series of offenses, the most famous of which involved a temple bell. The inscription on the bell, which was dedicated to a temple Hideyori had rebuilt, was interpreted by Ieyasu as a curse against him and his family. This accusation, though flimsy, provided the necessary political justification for a military campaign against the Toyotomi clan. The conflict, known as the Winter Siege of Osaka, began in 1614. Ieyasu, commanding a massive army of over 160,000 soldiers, laid siege to Osaka Castle. The castle itself was one of the most formidable in Japan, with multiple layers of walls, moats, and a massive keep. The Toyotomi forces, a desperate coalition of Ronin masterless samurai and daimyo loyal to Hideyori, mounted a fierce defense. The siege was a difficult and costly affair, and after months of stalemate, Ieyasu resorted to a political solution. He offered a truce, but under a condition that the outer moat of the castle be filled in. Hideyori's side agreed to the terms, believing it would end the conflict. However, the truce was a strategic deception. After the outer moat was filled, Ieyasu, in a blatant act of political opportunism, had his forces fill in the inner moat as well. This left the castle's defences almost entirely exposed. With the castle now vulnerable, Ieyasu orchestrated a second campaign, the Summer Siege of Osaka, in 1615. This time, the battle was brief and decisive. Ieyasu's army launched a final, overwhelming assault that broke through the weakened defences. Hideyori and his mother, Yorodono, were killed, and the castle was burned to the ground. The complete annihilation of the Toyotomi clan and the death of Hideyori marked the final end of any organized resistance to Ieyasu's rule. With the last of his rivals eliminated, Ieyasu's control was absolute, and the Tokugawa family's reign was secured for generations to come. The final elimination of the Toyotomi clan at the Siege of Osaka secured the Tokugawa shogunate's authority and brought an end to over a century of continuous civil war. With the nation unified under a single powerful government and the last of its rivals destroyed, the Tokugawa shogunate ushered in an era of unprecedented stability known as the Pax Tokugawa. This peace, which would last for more than 250 years, fundamentally ended the samurai's traditional role as warriors and forced the entire class to adapt to a new reality. The key to this long peace was the shogunate's policy of absolute centralization and control, which was designed to prevent any daimyo from accumulating enough power to challenge the Tokugawa family. The shogunate implemented a system known as sankin kitai, or alternate attendance. Under this system, daimyo from all over the country were required to spend every other year in the capital of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. When they returned to their home provinces, they were required to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as hostages. This policy served two main purposes. It placed an immense financial burden on the daimyo, preventing them from building up military resources, and it ensured that their families were under the direct control of the shogun, effectively guaranteeing their loyalty. Furthermore, the shogunate enacted a series of laws and regulations that severely restricted the military activities of the daimyo. The one castle per province rule limited each daimyo to a single castle in their domain, making it more difficult to mount a rebellion. The shogunate also forbade any new castle construction or the repair of existing fortifications without its explicit permission. These policies, combined with a comprehensive network of spies and informants, allowed the shogunate to maintain a tight grip on power and prevent the formation of any rival coalitions. This radical shift from a period of constant warfare to a long era of peace had a profound effect on the samurai class. With no battles to be fought, the samurai's traditional role as battle-hardened fighters was no longer relevant. Their martial skills, once the sole source of their status and prestige, were now largely ceremonial. This forced the samurai class to adapt to a new reality, transitioning from a military elite to an urban, bureaucratic elite. They became government administrators, tax collectors, scholars, and teachers. While the sword remained the exclusive symbol of their class, their primary responsibilities shifted to managing the daily affairs of the new urban society. This transformation was a fundamental change in the identity and purpose of the samurai, and it created a new social order that, while stable, contained the seeds of its own eventual decline. The establishment of the Pax Tokugawa, a long period of unprecedented peace, created a new and fundamental challenge for the samurai class. For centuries, their identity, status, and purpose had been inextricably linked to their role as warriors. With no battles to be fought and no enemies to be conquered, the samurai's traditional skills and martial prowess became largely obsolete. The Tokugawa shogunate, however, was a government ruled by samurai, and to maintain their position at the top of the social hierarchy, the warrior class was forced to undergo a radical transformation. They became bureaucrats. The shogunate's policy of absolute centralization and control demanded a massive and intricate administrative structure to govern the nation's 250-plus daimyo and their domains. This new bureaucracy provided the samurai with a new and necessary purpose. They were appointed to positions as government administrators, tax collectors, magistrates, and scholars. Their status and income, once tied to their martial achievements and the land they controlled, were now tied to their role within this sprawling bureaucracy. This shift was a fundamental change in the identity and purpose of the samurai, as their primary responsibilities shifted from the battlefield to the administrative office. To succeed in this new environment, the samurai had to acquire a new set of skills. The ability to read, write, and perform administrative duties became just as important as swordsmanship and horsemanship. Many samurai, particularly those in the higher ranks, embraced a new intellectual culture, studying Confucianism, philosophy, and classical literature. These pursuits were not just a pastime, but a necessary part of their new identity as a governing elite. The samurai's martial skills, while still a source of immense pride, were now largely ceremonial, reserved for official duels and for training in a world that no longer required their use on the battlefield. The samurai class, in effect, became an urban bureaucratic elite, residing in the castle towns of the daimyo and in the capital of Edo. This transformation created a new social dynamic within the samurai class. A clear distinction emerged between the warrior aristocracy, who held positions of power and prestige, and the lower-ranking samurai, who often struggled with a fixed income and a lack of opportunities for advancement. Their fixed salaries, often paid in rice, left many in a precarious economic position, as they were unable to engage in commerce and were ill-equipped to handle a world that no longer valued their traditional skills. This internal stratification, a direct consequence of the long peace, sowed the seeds of a profound discontent that would eventually contribute to the shogunate's decline. After more than 2 centuries of peace and isolation, the stability of the Tokugawa shogunate began to unravel in the mid-19th century. This period, known as the Bakumatsu, end of the shogunate, was characterized by immense foreign pressure and a growing wave of internal dissent. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in 1853 and his demand that Japan open its ports to foreign trade exposed the shogunate's military weakness and its inability to resist Western power. This created a profound crisis of confidence in the government, and a new political movement centered on the slogan Sun Ji, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, gained widespread support. Kyoto, the seat of the emperor, became a hotbed of anti-shogunate and anti-foreign sentiment, with numerous ronin, or masterless samurai, gathering to plot against the government. In this turbulent environment, a special police force known as the Shinsengumi, or New Select Brigade, emerged in Kyoto to protect the shogunate's interests. The Shinsengumi was a unit of elite swordsmen, comprised primarily of ronin and other low-ranking samurai who were fiercely loyal to the Tokugawa government. Their creation was a direct response to the political violence and assassinations being carried out by the anti-shogunate forces. The Shinsengumi's primary task was to police the streets of Kyoto, to identify and neutralize anti-shogunate samurai, and to suppress the growing tide of political dissent. The Shinsengumi became famous and feared for their strict code of conduct and their unwavering loyalty to the shogunate. Their code, known as the Kyokuchi, Hatto, or regulations of the Shinsengumi, demanded absolute obedience, prohibited desertion, and enforced a zero-tolerance policy for cowardice. Violations of the code were met with ritual suicide, or seppuku. The Shinsengumi's members were expert swordsmen, and their bloody battles in the streets of Kyoto, such as the famous Ikedaya incident, became the stuff of legend. The Ikedaya incident, in which a small force of Shinsengumi raided an inn and foiled a plot to set fire to Kyoto and kidnap the emperor, was a major blow to the anti-shogunate movement and cemented the Shinsengumi's reputation as a ruthless and effective police force. The Shinsengumi's existence was a throwback to the samurai's warrior past. In an era of peace and bureaucracy, they represented the last desperate struggle of the old order to survive. Their reliance on the sword, their unwavering loyalty, and their willingness to use violence to enforce a political ideology made them a powerful symbol of the samurai ethos in an age when that ethos was quickly becoming obsolete. Their bloody battles in the streets of Kyoto symbolized the final, desperate struggle of the samurai class to maintain its authority in the face of both foreign pressure and a growing internal movement that sought to dismantle the shogunate and restore the emperor to a position of genuine power. The Shinsengumi's tragic fate, however, was sealed by the larger political forces at play, and their story would end with the fall of the shogunate they had so fiercely defended. The instability of the Bakumatsu period, fueled by foreign pressure and internal dissent, created a political environment where a decisive military conflict was inevitable. The Tokugawa shogunate's perceived weakness in the face of Western powers had eroded its authority, and a new political movement, centered on the slogan, Sun, I, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, gained widespread support among a growing number of influential daimyo. This anti-shogunate movement found its most powerful and organized expression in an unlikely alliance between two of the shogunate's most formidable rival domains, Satsuma and Chash. For centuries, Satsuma and Chasha had been bitter rivals of the Tokugawa, with a deep-seated resentment that stemmed from their defeat at the Battle of Sekigahara. However, under the guidance of key political figures like Saige Takamori of Satsuma and Kido Takayoshi of Chash, the two domains set aside their historical animosity. This was a pragmatic and strategic alliance, born from the shared goal of dismantling the shogunate and restoring the emperor to a position of genuine political power. The alliance, known as the Satsuma-Chaige Alliance, was a secret pact that brought together the military and financial resources of two of the wealthiest domains in Japan, creating a formidable force that the shogunate was ill-equipped to handle. The alliance was not only a political union but also a military one. Both domains had been actively modernizing their armies, acquiring Western firearms and artillery, and training their soldiers in modern European military tactics. This gave them a significant technological and tactical advantage over the shogunate's forces, which, despite some modernization efforts, still relied on a large number of traditional samurai and outdated military doctrines. The alliance's military leaders, particularly Mura Masujiya of Chash, were instrumental in creating a new, disciplined and technologically advanced army that was a potent force for change. The simmering conflict between the anti-shogunate forces and the Tokugawa government finally erupted into open civil war with the Boshin War of 1868. The war was a brutal and decisive conflict that pitted the modern, Western-style armies of the Satsuma-Chash alliance against the shogunate's forces and the last remnants of the traditional samurai order. The alliance's military superiority, both in terms of technology and tactics, was immediately apparent. They won a series of key battles, including the decisive Battle of Toba Fushimi, which broke the shogunate's resistance and paved the way for the occupation of Kyoto. The Boshin War was a final and bloody struggle between the old feudal order and the new forces of modernization and imperial rule, and its outcome would irrevocably alter the course of Japanese history. The Boshin War, which erupted in 1868, was a brutal civil conflict that pitted the modernized armies of the Satsuma-Chaige alliance against the shogunate's forces, marking the final military confrontation of Japan's feudal era. The shogunate's army, despite some modernization efforts, was tactically and technologically outmatched by the imperial forces. The alliance's military superiority, which was evident in their use of Western firearms and artillery, allowed them to win a series of decisive battles, the most notable of which was the Battle of Toba Fushimi. This victory, fought near the capital of Kyoto, broke the shogunate's resistance and forced the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, to retreat. Faced with a rapidly advancing imperial army and the collapse of his political authority, Tokugawa Yoshinobu made a momentous decision that would define the peaceful end of the conflict. He chose not to fight a prolonged war of attrition that would have devastated the nation and likely resulted in his own destruction. Instead, he surrendered to the imperial forces, bringing an end to over 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. His surrender, while controversial among his loyalists, was a pragmatic and strategic act that prevented further bloodshed and allowed for a relatively smooth transition of power. With the shogun's surrender, the Tokugawa government was formally dissolved. The vast land holdings of the Tokugawa clan were confiscated, and the administrative offices of the shogunate were abolished. This epochal event, the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, marked the final political death of the samurai class's central government. For the first time in over 600 years, Japan was no longer ruled by a shogun. The end of the shogunate officially ushered in the Meiji Restoration, a period of rapid modernization and westernization. The new Meiji government, comprised of leaders from the Satsuma-Chish alliance, was determined to transform Japan into a modern nation-state capable of competing with the Western powers. Their primary goal was to create a centralized state with a unified national army, a modern bureaucracy, and a single legitimate head of state in the form of the emperor. The Meiji Restoration, however, was not just a political transition. It was a fundamental social and economic revolution. The new government's policies were aimed at dismantling the feudal system and abolishing the samurai class itself. The samurai, who had ruled Japan for centuries, were now faced with the prospect of losing their inherited status, their stipends, and their very identity. This radical change was met with resistance. But the new government, with its modern army and unwavering political will, was prepared to enforce its new order. The Boshin War, which ended with the shogun's surrender, had settled the question of who would rule Japan, but it had not yet settled the question of what would become of the samurai. The surrender of the last shogun and the dissolution of the Tokugawa government marked the official start of the Meiji Restoration, an era of rapid and profound transformation for Japan. The new Meiji government, led by a coalition of influential leaders from the Satsuma and Chash domains, was driven by a powerful vision to transform Japan into a modern nation-state capable of competing with the Western powers that had forced an end to the country's 2-century-long isolation. This new government, while nominally in the name of the emperor, was a radical departure from the feudal past, and its policies were aimed at dismantling the very foundations of samurai rule. The new government's primary goal was to centralize power and create a unified national identity. To achieve this, it implemented a series of sweeping reforms that directly targeted the samurai class, which had been the ruling elite for over 600 years. The government began by dismantling the feudal system, a process that involved the abolition of the traditional daimyo domains. The daimyo were ordered to cede their land and their authority to the central government, a move that was initially met with resistance but was ultimately enforced with the threat of military force. These domains were then reorganized into a new system of prefectures, with governors appointed by the central government, effectively eliminating the daimyo's political power. The most radical and consequential policy, however, was the abolition of the samurai as a distinct social class. In 1871, the government issued a decree that officially ended the samurai's inherited status, their stipends, and their right to wear swords. This edict, known as the Hate-Rei, was a symbolic and practical act that struck at the very core of the samurai's identity. The sword, which had for centuries been a symbol of a samurai's honor, status, and right to rule, was now a forbidden object for public wear. This radical move was not just a social reform. It was a political act designed to dismantle the feudal military class and create a new modern national army based on universal conscription. This radical change, which stripped the samurai of their centuries-old privileges, was met with predictable resistance. A number of revolts, led by disillusioned samurai, erupted in the years that followed. These rebellions, however, were brutally suppressed by the new government's modernized and conscripted army. The government's military superiority, both in terms of technology and manpower, was now undeniable, and its political will to enforce its new order was absolute. The abolition of the samurai as a feudal class was a defining moment of the Meiji Restoration, marking the end of a long era of warrior rule and the beginning of a new, modern Japan. The new Meiji government's radical reforms, which stripped the samurai of their inherited status, stipends, and the right to carry swords, were met with predictable and mounting resistance. While many samurai embraced the new order and found new roles in the modern bureaucracy or military, a significant number of disillusioned warriors, particularly in the Western domains, refused to accept their loss of status and prestige. This growing discontent, fueled by the economic hardship caused by the abolition of their stipends and a deep sense of cultural betrayal, ultimately erupted into a series of revolts. The largest and most significant of these rebellions was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, a final, desperate stand of traditional samurai against the modernizing forces of the Meiji government. The rebellion was led by Saige Takamori, a revered figure from the Satsuma domain who had been instrumental in the Meiji Restoration itself. Saige, a true samurai at heart, grew disillusioned with the direction of the new government, particularly its rapid and seemingly un-Japanese westernization. His followers, a coalition of approximately 40,000 disaffected samurai from Satsuma, were the last remnants of the old feudal order, and they were determined to fight to preserve their way of life and their honor. The rebellion was, in essence, a final, bloody confrontation between the traditions of the past and the inexorable forces of modernization. The government's response to the rebellion was swift and overwhelming. The new National Army, a conscripted force of commoners, was armed with modern firearms and artillery and trained in modern military tactics. This new army, which was a direct result of the reforms that Saige and his followers so fiercely opposed, was a formidable military force. The rebellion began with an unsuccessful siege of Kumamoto Castle, where Saige's forces suffered heavy casualties, a pivotal moment that demonstrated the superiority of modern fortifications and firearms over traditional samurai tactics. The rebellion culminated in the Battle of Shiroyama, a final desperate stand by Saige and his remaining 400 samurai against a government army of over 30,000 soldiers. The battle was a tragic and symbolic end to the rebellion. Surrounded on a small hill, the samurai, outgunned and outnumbered, fought to the last man. Saige Takamori, wounded in the battle, either committed seppuku or was killed by a loyal follower. His death marked the final bloody sunset of the samurai as a military and political force, a romanticized but tragic end to their long history. The Satsuma Rebellion proved that there was no place for the traditional samurai in modern Japan, and its defeat cemented the new government's authority and its vision for a modern centralized nation-state. The final bloody defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion marked the end of the samurai as a military and political force, but it did not erase their cultural and philosophical legacy. The values and principles that had governed their lives and deaths, codified as Bushido, or the way of the warrior, lived on. While the samurai ethos had always existed in a more fluid, unwritten form throughout the long eras of civil war, it was during the peaceful Edo period that it was formally systematized and promoted. In the absence of war, the samurai's function shifted from combat to governance, and their warrior code was adapted to a new bureaucratic reality, emphasizing loyalty, obedience, and intellectual pursuits. Bushido was a complex and multifaceted philosophy that emphasized a series of core virtues. Loyalty, or chi-gi, was paramount, demanding a samurai's unwavering devotion to their lord. This loyalty was not a simple act of obedience, but a profound, spiritual commitment that transcended life itself. Courage, or why, was also a central tenet, but it was not simply a matter of bravery on the battlefield. It was a moral courage that demanded a samurai to do what was right, even in the face of certain death. Honor, or meio, was the ultimate virtue, a samurai's reputation and integrity being more important than their life. This emphasis on honor gave rise to the practice of seppuku, a ritual suicide that allowed a samurai to preserve his honor in the face of defeat or failure. While the historical origins of Bushido are debated, its influence on Japanese nationalism, military philosophy, and corporate culture has been profound and enduring. In the Meiji period, following the abolition of the samurai class, the new government, comprised of former samurai, actively promoted Bushido as a unifying national ideology. The code's emphasis on loyalty and self-sacrifice was a perfect fit for a nation seeking to build a strong, modern military and a national identity. It was taught in schools and became the foundation of the Imperial Japanese Army's code of conduct. In the 20th century, Bushido was used to justify Japanese militarism and extreme nationalism, with its tenets of unquestioning loyalty and self-sacrifice being reinterpreted to serve the goals of the state. However, its influence was not limited to the military. In the post-war era, the principles of Bushido were adapted to the world of business and corporate culture. The emphasis on loyalty to one's company, the dedication to hard work, and the importance of honor in business dealings are all modern reflections of this ancient code. The samurai as a social class may have vanished, but their cultural and philosophical legacy in the form of Bushido continues to shape modern Japan. The samurai's identity and martial prowess were inextricably linked to the tools and craftsmanship that defined their art of warfare. Over centuries of continuous conflict, their armor and weaponry evolved to adapt to the changing nature of the battlefield, with each piece of equipment becoming a symbol of the warrior's status, skill, and cultural heritage. The most iconic of these tools was the sword, the katana, but the samurai's arsenal was far more diverse and sophisticated than is often portrayed. The evolution of samurai armor, or yoroi, reflected a shift from the elegant but heavy designs of the Heian period to the more practical and durable armor of the Sengoku Jidai. Early yoroi, known as yoroi great armor, was composed of small iron plates laced together with silk cords, creating a flexible and visually stunning form of protection that was well suited for a warrior on horseback. However, its weight and design made it less effective for fighting on foot. The Sengoku Jidai, with its large-scale infantry battles, demanded a new type of armor. This led to the development of Di, Maru, and Haramaki armor, which were more lightweight and practical, allowing for greater mobility on the battlefield. The introduction of firearms in the 16th century further spurred innovation, with armor becoming more robust and incorporating a greater number of solid forged plates to provide better protection against bullets. While the armor was designed for protection, the weapons of the samurai were instruments of both war and art. The katana, the long curved single-edged sword, was the most famous of these weapons. Forged from high carbon steel through a meticulous process of folding and tempering, the katana was a marvel of metallurgical engineering, possessing a blade of exceptional sharpness and durability. It was the exclusive right of the samurai to carry this weapon, and it became the ultimate symbol of their class, their honor, and their political authority. The katana was often accompanied by the wakizashi, a shorter sword worn as a companion blade. The combination of the two swords, known as the daish, large and small, was a defining feature of the samurai class and was a powerful visual indicator of their status. In addition to their swords, the samurai were masters of a wide range of other weapons. The spear, or yari, was a staple of the battlefield, used by both elite samurai and foot soldiers in massed formations. The naginata, a long pole weapon with a curved blade, was a weapon of choice for female warriors, honor bugisha, and for close-quarters combat. Archery was also a central component of samurai warfare. The yumi, a long bow of asymmetrical design, was a powerful and accurate weapon that could be used from horseback. Samurai archers were a formidable force on the battlefield, and their skill with the bow was considered a high art. Each of these weapons and pieces of armor was not merely a tool of war, but a product of centuries of craftsmanship, a reflection of the samurai's evolving identity, and a lasting legacy of a martial class that shaped the course of Japanese history. The philosophical and ethical principles that guided the samurai, collectively known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior, were not a static set of rules, but a fluid and evolving philosophy that adapted to the changing political and social landscape of Japan. While its core tenets of honor, courage, and loyalty existed in a more informal, unwritten form during the medieval era of constant civil war, it was during the long peace of the Tokugawa period that Bushido was formally codified and systematized. This transformation of the warrior's code reflected the radical shift in the samurai's role, from battle-hardened fighters to an urban, bureaucratic elite. In the medieval period of the Kamakura and Sengoku Jidai, the principles of Bushido were practical, rooted in the brutal realities of the battlefield. The emphasis was on martial prowess, personal honor, and the unwavering loyalty of a samurai to his lord, a bond that was often secured through land grants and military service. The concept of seppuku, or ritual suicide, for example, was a practical means of avoiding capture and preserving one's honor in the face of defeat. This early form of Bushido was a pragmatic and often brutal code of conduct that prioritized military effectiveness and the survival of a clan above all else. The long peace of the Tokugawa period, which ended major warfare for over 250 years, forced the samurai to adapt their warrior identity to a new, peaceful reality. With no battles to be fought, the focus of Bushido shifted from battlefield courage to intellectual pursuits and administrative duties. Confucianism, with its emphasis on a rigid social hierarchy, loyalty, and filial piety, became a central pillar of the new Bushido. The samurai, now serving as government administrators, tax collectors, and magistrates, had to acquire new skills and a new intellectual framework to justify their position at the top of the social pyramid. This new, refined Bushido placed a greater emphasis on obedience, self-discipline, and intellectual pursuits. The code's core virtues were reinterpreted for a bureaucratic class. Loyalty, for example, was no longer just a matter of military service, but a bureaucratic duty to the shogun and the state. Honor was no longer just about bravery in battle, but about a samurai's integrity and conduct in his administrative duties. The samurai were encouraged to pursue intellectual and artistic pastimes, such as the tea ceremony, calligraphy, and poetry, as a means of cultivating their inner character and maintaining their cultural superiority over the merchant and peasant classes. This transformation of the warrior's code allowed the samurai to preserve their identity as a ruling elite in an era that no longer required their traditional skills. But it also sowed the seeds of a profound discontent, as the gap between the samurai's martial heritage and their peaceful bureaucratic reality grew wider over time. The heroic, tragic, and romantic lives of the samurai, which defined the political and military landscape of Japan for centuries, became a central and enduring theme in the nation's cultural output. These literary and artistic traditions were not merely a means of preserving historical events. They were a powerful force that molded the image of the samurai in the national imagination, celebrating their honor, lamenting their ultimate fate, and providing a cultural framework for understanding the complexities of their existence. From the medieval era to the peaceful Tokugawa period, the samurai's story was a constant source of inspiration for writers, artists, and dramatists. One of the most significant and influential works of samurai literature is the Heike Monogatari, or The Tale of the Heike. This epic prose poem, which was compiled and transmitted orally by traveling monks, chronicles the epic rise and fall of the Taira clan during the Genpei War. It is a work of immense historical and literary importance, chronicling the brutal realities of war and the impermanence of all things, a central tenet of Buddhist philosophy. The Heike Monogatari not only provided a detailed account of the war, but also established a powerful narrative of tragedy and heroism, immortalizing the Taira warriors as both arrogant aristocrats and tragic heroes. The samurai's story also found a powerful and stylized expression in the world of Japanese theater. No theater, which developed during the Muromachi period, often featured samurai warriors as its central characters. These plays, with their slow, deliberate movements and symbolic costumes, explored the spiritual and psychological turmoil of the samurai, often focusing on themes of loyalty, revenge, and redemption. No was a high art form, patronized by the shogun and the daimyo, and it provided a serious and philosophical exploration of the samurai ethos. Kabuki theater, which emerged during the Edo period, took a more popular and dramatic approach. With its elaborate costumes, stylized makeup, and dynamic staging, Kabuki presented a more romanticized and action-oriented vision of the samurai, celebrating their heroism and often lamenting their downfall in a world of peace and bureaucracy. In the visual arts, the samurai were a constant and vibrant theme. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which flourished during the Edo period, often depicted famous samurai warriors, legendary battles, and dramatic scenes from samurai plays. These prints, which were a form of popular art, played a crucial role in shaping the public's perception of the samurai, often romanticizing their lives and their adherence to a strict code of honor. Similarly, samurai stories were a popular theme in a wide range of other art forms, including painting, sculpture, and metalwork, with each medium providing a unique lens through which to view the heroic, tragic, and romantic lives of Japan's warrior class. While samurai history is often viewed almost exclusively through a masculine lens, the role of women within this warrior society was both vital and often overlooked. The samurai class was a military aristocracy, and the women who belonged to it were expected to uphold the same rigorous standards of discipline, honor, and loyalty that were demanded of their male counterparts. While their primary duties were to manage the household and raise the next generation of samurai, many women were also trained in martial arts and were prepared to fight to defend their homes and families in times of war. These women, known as honor bugeisha, or female martial artists, were a crucial component of samurai society. They were not typically frontline soldiers, but their military training was a necessary and expected part of their upbringing. They were taught to use a variety of weapons, but they specialized in the naginata, a long pole weapon with a curved blade. The naginata's length and sweeping movements made it particularly effective for a smaller, lighter warrior, allowing her to keep a larger opponent at a distance. The women of the samurai class were expected to be proficient with this weapon, not for offensive campaigns, but for the defense of their homes and castles in the absence of their husbands and sons, who were often away, fighting. The contributions of these women to the samurai ethos were a crucial part of the warrior class's enduring identity. Their courage, their loyalty, and their unwavering commitment to their family and clan were celebrated and became a central theme in samurai lore and legend. Historical figures like Tomo Gozen, a female warrior who fought in the Genpei War, and Ha Masako, who ruled the Kamakura shogunate as regent, demonstrate the significant political and military power that some women were able to wield. These figures, while not representative of the average samurai woman, highlight the fact that women were not simply passive bystanders in the centuries of civil war. The long peace of the Tokugawa period, which saw the samurai transition from warriors to bureaucrats, also had a profound effect on the role of women in samurai society. With no battles to be fought, the emphasis on martial training for women declined. Their role became more focused on domestic duties, intellectual pursuits, and the cultivation of cultural skills, such as the tea ceremony and flower arranging. The naginata, which had once been a practical weapon for defense, became a ceremonial and symbolic part of a samurai woman's wedding dowry, a final and enduring symbol of her commitment to the warrior ethos. The onobu geisha were a critical part of samurai history, and their contributions, while often overlooked in traditional accounts, were a crucial part of the warrior class's enduring identity. The adoption of Zen Buddhism by the samurai class, particularly during the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, was a pivotal cultural event that had a profound and lasting impact on their culture and philosophy. Zen, which was brought to Japan from China, offered a unique and powerful spiritual framework that resonated deeply with the warrior ethos. Unlike other Buddhist sects, Zen emphasized enlightenment not through scriptural study or ritual, but through personal discipline, meditation, zazen, and direct intuitive experience. This emphasis on self-reliance, rigorous training, and a focus on the present moment aligned perfectly with the samurai's life of constant martial discipline and the ever-present reality of death. The Zen emphasis on discipline, simplicity, and direct experience profoundly influenced every aspect of samurai culture and aesthetics. The quiet discipline of Zen became a spiritual counterbalance to the brutal realities of samurai life, providing a path to inner peace amidst the turmoil of war. The Zen ideal of stripping away excess to reveal the essential became a central aesthetic principle that was applied to a wide range of artistic and cultural practices, creating a new, uniquely Japanese aesthetic that was distinct from the elaborate and ornamental styles of the Heian court. This new aesthetic gave rise to some of Japan's most iconic art forms. The tranquil beauty of karasansui, or rock gardens, with their minimalist arrangements of rocks, sand, and moss, reflected the Zen pursuit of inner peace and meditation. These gardens, which were often found in Zen temples and the estates of samurai, were not meant for walking but for quiet contemplation, with the rocks representing islands and the raked sand representing the ocean, a symbolic landscape for a meditative mind. Similarly, sumi-e, or inkwash painting, became a favored art form among the samurai, as its spare, elegant lines and focus on capturing the essence of a subject in a single brushstroke mirrored the Zen ideal of spontaneous and unhesitating action. The tea ceremony, or chan-or-yu, also flourished under Zen influence. It was transformed from a simple act of drinking tea into a complex, ritualized performance that embodied the principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. The quiet, understated beauty of the tea ceremony, which was often held in a simple rustic tea hut, was a direct reflection of the Zen ideal of finding beauty in the ordinary and finding peace in a world of turmoil. These aesthetic traditions were not mere pastimes, but were integral to the samurai's new identity, blending the rigorous discipline of the warrior with the refined sensibilities of the scholar. The quiet discipline of Zen provided a spiritual anchor for a class that lived with the ever-present reality of death, allowing them to find a path to inner peace and enlightenment amidst the chaos of war. Beyond the idealized image of the samurai on the battlefield, their daily life was a world of strict routine, martial training, and social rituals. The samurai were the ruling class, and their lifestyle, from their diet to their education, was a reflection of their social status and their adherence to a strict code of discipline. Their lives were governed by a sense of aesthetic discipline that contrasted sharply with the violence of their profession, a duality that was particularly pronounced during the long peace of the Tokugawa period. The samurai diet was a central component of their daily life, and it reflected both their social status and the agricultural realities of Japan. Rice was the cornerstone of their diet, and their income was often measured in terms of koku, a unit of rice equivalent to the amount needed to feed one person for a year. A samurai's prestige and wealth were directly proportional to their rice stipend. In addition to rice, their diet included a variety of fish, vegetables, and fermented foods like miso and soy sauce. The emphasis was on a simple, nutritious diet that was in line with the principles of self-discipline and austerity that were central to the samurai ethos. This was a stark contrast to the rich, decadent food of the imperial court, and it served to further distinguish the military aristocracy from the traditional nobility. Martial training remained a crucial part of the samurai's daily routine, even during the peaceful Edo period. The skills of swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship were no longer needed for actual combat, but they were practiced relentlessly to maintain discipline, focus, and a connection to their warrior heritage. The training was not just about physical proficiency, but also about spiritual and mental discipline, with the principles of Zen Buddhism often integrated into their practice. The martial arts, or bujutsu, became a path to self-improvement and spiritual enlightenment, a way for the samurai to justify their existence in a world that no longer required their skills on the battlefield. In addition to martial training, the samurai's daily life was filled with a variety of social and cultural rituals. The practice of the tea ceremony, or chanoyu, which had flourished under Zen influence, became a central part of their social lives. The ceremony, with its emphasis on harmony, respect, and tranquility, provided a quiet and meditative escape from the stresses of their bureaucratic duties. Similarly, the art of flower arrangement, or ikebana, and the appreciation of poetry and calligraphy became popular pastimes, a way for the samurai to cultivate their inner character and demonstrate their refined sensibilities. These social rituals were not just hobbies, they were integral to the samurai's new identity, blending the discipline of the warrior with the refined sensibilities of the scholar. The samurai's existence, defined by a life of martial discipline and loyalty, found its ultimate expression in the manner of their death. The practice of seppuku, or ritual suicide by disembowelment, was a central and defining feature of samurai culture. It was not an act of surrender, but a final and definitive act of self-control that allowed a samurai to preserve their honor in the face of defeat or a profound failure. The act was so deeply ingrained in the samurai ethos that it became a legal right for samurai to take their own lives, rather than be executed as a common criminal, a privilege that was denied to all other social classes. The origins of seppuku can be traced back to the medieval era, but it was during the long peace of the Tokugawa period that it was formally codified and ritualized. In the absence of war, the practice evolved from a spontaneous act on the battlefield into a highly structured and ceremonial event. The ritual was performed with a tant, a short dagger, and involved a series of precise and deliberate actions. The samurai would first perform a series of purification rituals, write a death poem, and then, in front of witnesses, make a deep cut across his abdomen. The act was a demonstration of a warrior's unwavering commitment to their code, a final and definitive act of self-control that allowed them to choose their own end and preserve their honor. The practice of seppuku was a demonstration of a samurai's honor, or meiyo, a virtue that was considered more important than life itself. A samurai's honor was not just a personal matter, but was inextricably linked to the honor of his lord and his family. A samurai who had failed in his duty, committed a crime, or brought shame upon his lord could atone for his mistakes and restore his honor through seppuku. The act was seen as a final and definitive way of demonstrating a samurai's loyalty, a profound act of self-sacrifice that would redeem his name and ensure the continued honor of his family. Seppuku was also a tool of the shogunate for political control. In the Tokugawa period, it was used as a form of capital punishment for samurai who had committed serious offenses. The government, rather than publicly executing a samurai as a criminal, would grant him the honor of committing seppuku, allowing him to die with a degree of dignity. This political use of the ritual served to reinforce the samurai's special status, while also providing the shogunate with a powerful tool for social control. The practice of seppuku, with its emphasis on honor, loyalty, and self-control, was a profound and complex part of samurai culture. It was a final and definitive act that allowed a warrior to choose his own end and preserve his honor in the face of defeat, and it remains one of the most enduring and powerful symbols of the samurai ethos. The iconic image of the samurai, a lone warrior wielding a katana with an unwavering sense of honor, has transcended its historical origins to become a global cultural icon. While the samurai as a social class was abolished in the 19th century, their enduring legacy has been kept alive and often reimagined in countless forms of modern media and popular culture. This cultural influence has been profound and far-reaching, shaping the perception of Japan and its history for audiences around the world. The samurai, in their modern portrayal, serve as a symbol of heroism, honor, and martial discipline, a powerful ideal that continues to captivate global audiences. One of the most significant forces in shaping the modern image of the samurai was the masterful cinema of Akira Kurosawa. Films like Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Rashomon introduced the world to the depth and tragedy of the samurai spirit, portraying them not just as warriors, but as complex and flawed individuals, grappling with questions of loyalty, honor, and a changing world. Kurosawa's films, with their breathtaking cinematography and powerful human drama, were a monumental influence on Western cinema, inspiring countless films and television shows, and cementing the samurai's image as a noble and tragic hero. The samurai have also found a vibrant and dynamic home in the world of video games. Games like Ghost of Tsushima, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, and Neo have allowed players to not only experience the brutal realities of samurai combat, but to immerse themselves in a meticulously rendered historical and mythological world. These games, with their focus on honor, redemption, and the mastery of a weapon, have brought the samurai ethos to a new generation of audiences. They have been instrumental in popularizing samurai history and culture, making the katana, the feudal armor, and the principles of Bushido familiar to millions of players worldwide. Beyond film and games, the samurai continue to be a popular theme in a wide range of other media, including comic books, manga, and anime. Works like Lone Wolf and Cub, Vagabond, and Rurouni Kenshin have explored the samurai's world in a variety of styles, from the gritty and realistic to the fantastical and romanticized. These works, with their focus on themes of vengeance, redemption, and the search for one's purpose, have helped to keep the samurai's legacy alive and relevant in a rapidly changing world. The samurai's iconic image, from their distinctive armor and weaponry to their unwavering sense of honor, has transcended its historical origins to become a powerful symbol of Japan's enduring cultural identity. In a world that often values speed and efficiency, the samurai's legacy of discipline, patience, and honor continues to resonate, providing a timeless ideal of the warrior spirit. While the samurai as a social and political class was abolished in the Meiji Restoration, their legacy continues to exert a profound and enduring influence on modern Japanese society. The values and principles that were codified in Bushido, which emphasize loyalty, self-discipline, honor, and hard work, did not disappear with the end of the feudal era. Instead, they were adapted and reinterpreted to serve the needs of a new, modern nation-state, and they can be seen today in a wide range of cultural, social, and economic practices, from corporate culture to national identity. The Meiji government, which was led by former samurai, actively promoted the values of Bushido as a unifying national ideology. The code's emphasis on unquestioning loyalty and self-sacrifice was a perfect fit for a nation seeking to build a strong modern military and a cohesive national identity. These values were taught in schools and became the foundation of the Imperial Japanese Army's code of conduct. This nationalistic reinterpretation of Bushido served as a powerful tool for galvanizing the nation in its quest for modernization and imperial expansion. In the post-war era, with the abolition of the imperial military, the principles of Bushido were adapted to the world of business and corporate culture. The concept of group loyalty, or chi-gi, which had previously bound a samurai to his lord, was reinterpreted to mean a profound and lifelong commitment to one's company. This is reflected in the traditional Japanese practice of lifetime employment, where an employee's loyalty to their company is absolute and their identity is inextricably linked to their work. Similarly, the samurai's emphasis on discipline, hard work, and the pursuit of mastery can be seen in the Japanese work ethic, which is characterized by a relentless dedication to quality and continuous improvement. The influence of the samurai ethos can also be seen in the Japanese education system, which places a strong emphasis on discipline, respect for authority, and a profound work ethic. The samurai's pursuit of intellectual and cultural refinement, which was a central tenet of the refined Bushido of the Edo period, has also endured. The practice of traditional arts like calligraphy, martial arts, and the tea ceremony, while no longer exclusive to the samurai class, continues to be a central part of Japanese cultural education. The samurai, in a very real sense, live on in the collective memory and cultural values of the nation they once ruled, providing a timeless ideal of discipline, honor, and dedication that continues to shape modern Japan. The story of the samurai is a journey of profound transformations, a history that began with their emergence as provincial bodyguards and culminated in their rise as the absolute rulers of an empire. Their ultimate fall, a period of rapid and often brutal change, was as dramatic and transformative as their ascent to power. The samurai's 600-year history is a testament to the powerful and contradictory forces that shaped Japan's feudal and modern identity. They were a class that embodied a complex and multifaceted ideal, a blend of martial prowess and cultural refinement that continues to resonate in the nation's collective memory. The samurai's rise was a direct consequence of the political instability of the Heian period. As the imperial court's power waned, a new military aristocracy, the Buke, emerged to fill the power vacuum. This new warrior class, through a series of decisive conflicts like the Genpei War, established its political dominance and, with the creation of the Kamakura shogunate, became the de facto rulers of Japan. The samurai's centuries-long rule was not a period of static feudalism, but a continuous evolution. From the disciplined loyalty of the Kamakura period to the brutal pragmatism of the Sengoku Jidai, an era that redefined the samurai ethos and produced the three great unifiers of Japan. The long peace of the Tokugawa period, which followed the brutal Sengoku Jidai, presented the samurai with their greatest challenge. With no battles to be fought, the samurai were forced to transform their identity, shifting from battle-hardened fighters to an urban, bureaucratic elite. This transformation, while preserving their status as the ruling class, sowed the seeds of a profound discontent that would eventually contribute to the shogunate's collapse. The final desperate stand of traditional samurai in the Boshin War and the Satsuma Rebellion marked a tragic end to their political and military existence, a bloody sunset for a class that had ruled Japan for over 6 centuries. However, the samurai's legacy did not end with their political demise. Their cultural and philosophical legacy, in the form of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was adapted and reinterpreted to serve the needs of a new modern Japan. The values of loyalty, self-discipline, and hard work, which were deeply rooted in the samurai ethos, were promoted as a unifying national ideology and became the foundation of modern Japanese culture, from its military to its corporate world. The samurai's enduring legacy, a blend of brutal warfare and elegant artistry, is a testament to the powerful and contradictory forces that shaped Japan's identity. The story of the samurai is, in a very real sense, the story of Japan itself.